My brother stood at the head of a conference table my father had bought at an estate sale in 1991 and told me I was too sentimental to run a business. 3.5 years later, he called me from the parking lot of that same building, crying into his phone at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night, asking if I could please just come home. I'm Felicity Rand. My father opened the first Rand smokehouse in Franklin, Tennessee in 1989 with a $14,000 loan and a pit smoker he'd rebuilt from a rusted-out half-barrel he found behind a scrapyard in Lapers Fork. By the time I was born, the Franklin location was full every Friday night. By the time I was in middle school, we had a second one in Brentwood. By the time I graduated from Belmont with a hospitality degree, my father was opening the third in Murfreesboro and sketching plans for a fourth on a yellow legal pad he kept in the front pocket of his flannel shirt. I knew that business the way you know a childhood home, not from reading about it, but from living in it. I knew which supplier to call on Tuesdays when the brisket order ran short. I knew why the Brentwood exhaust hood made a sound like a dying accordion every time the temperature dropped below 40, and I knew exactly how to fix it without calling a repairman. I had managed payroll during a snowstorm when our bookkeeper was stranded in Kentucky. I had rewritten our food costs tracking from scratch when I was 24 because my father's system was a spiral notebook and good intentions. I had done every job in those restaurants at least twice, starting with bussing tables the summer I turned 12. So when my father's cardiologist used the word serious in the fall of my 28th year, and my father started talking about the future of the business, I assumed we were talking about the same future he had always imagined. The one where I ran operations. The one where my decade of groundwork counted for something. My brother Burke had a different idea. Burke is 7 years older than me. He went to Vanderbilt, got his MBA from UT, spent 12 years working in commercial real estate development in Atlanta. He was good at what he did, genuinely good, and I'd never questioned that, but he'd eaten at the restaurants maybe a dozen times in the previous decade. He'd never worked a shift. He couldn't have told you what an internal meat temperature should be at pull, or why we sourced our wood from a family farm in Hickman County instead of buying cheaper from a regional distributor. None of that had ever been his world. But he was the oldest. And when my father's health declined faster than any of us expected that winter, and the conversations about succession stopped being hypothetical, Burke stepped in with a presentation. An actual slide deck. 14 slides about brand scalability and multi-unit expansion and leveraging the Rand Smokehouse IP. My father was tired and scared, and I think he genuinely believed in those months that what the business needed was someone who could see it from the outsides, someone who hadn't grown up loving it. Because love and clear-eyed management felt like opposites to him right then. He named Burke acting CEO 6 weeks before he passed. I was named Director of Restaurant Operations, which sounded meaningful until the shareholder meeting 2 months after my father's funeral, when Burke restructured the executive team and my title was quietly downgraded to an advisory role with no board vote. He brought in his friend Mitch Farrow, who had worked alongside him in commercial real estate and had never set foot in a food service business in his life, as CFO. Then Burke called a meeting to discuss my, and I'm quoting directly, continued contribution to the company, and told me, in front of Mitch and 2 outside advisors, that I led with emotion rather than data, that I was too invested in tradition to make the hard calls the company needed, and that going forward, major financial and strategic decisions would be handled through a process I wasn't positioned to lead. I don't remember driving home that day. I remember sitting in my apartment parking lot for a long time looking at the steering wheel. My father had built that business over 30 years. I had given it 10 years of my life, working my way up from bussing tables to managing 3 locations and setting the sourcing standards we still used. And my brother, who had ordered takeout from us more often than he'd ever actually worked alongside anyone in those kitchens, had just explained to me that I wasn't the right person to lead it forward. I had 2 options. I could fight it, publicly, through attorneys and shareholder disputes that would drag the family name through whatever the Nashville business press found interesting that month. Or I could leave and do something with the time I'd been given. I chose to leave. Not because I was surrendering. I want to be clear about that, because there's a version of this story where I'm the woman who walked away, and that's not it. I left because I understood, even then, that the only argument my brother would ever respect was one made in his own language. Numbers, documentation, proof. Grief wasn't going to do it. Righteous anger wasn't going to do it. I needed to be able to walk into a room and speak in a way that left no room for dismissal. I took a position with a regional restaurant consulting group out of Nashville called Hargrove Ops. They specialized in operational turnarounds for independent and small chain restaurants across the Southeast. It was a pay cut that stung. It was humbling in ways I hadn't anticipated, because I walked in there thinking I already knew most of what there was to know about running restaurants, and spent the first 4 months realizing how much I'd been operating on instinct and familiarity rather than rigorous analysis. My instincts were usually right, it turned out, but instincts you can't document are easy to argue against. That was the lesson. I learned how to read a profit and loss statement the way a diagnostician reads an X-ray, looking for the fractures other people gloss over because they don't want to find them. I learned cash flow forecasting and working capital management. I learned how to build a cost reduction plan that didn't gut the quality and culture that made a restaurant worth saving in the first place. I sat across the table from restaurant owners who were 6 months from closing and helped them build cases for their bankers, and I got good enough at it that my cases held up. I also learned, specifically and carefully, how to identify when losses were being hidden inside operational line items that wouldn't trigger flags until the damage was already done. I learned that because I'd seen it done before, in smaller ways by smaller players. And I filed it away. I told myself I was building a career. I was building a case. The first real signal came from my cousin Lacey, who managed front of house at the Murfreesboro location and called me every few weeks, mostly about her daughter's soccer games and a neighbor dispute she'd been navigating for 2 years. But one evening she mentioned, almost as a side note, that Murfreesboro had started running shorter hours on Wednesdays, without any announcement to staff. Then she mentioned that 2 of our pit masters, men who had worked for my father for 11 and 13 years respectively, men who understood the craft in a way that genuinely cannot be trained quickly, had both left within 6 months of each other. Voluntary departures, Burke had apparently told the remaining staff. Better opportunities. Then Lacey told me the brisket wasn't the same. She said it carefully, like she was afraid of what she was confirming by saying it out loud. Not terrible, she said, just not ours. I asked her to stop telling me things. Not because I didn't want to know. Because I needed clean hands. I didn't want Burke to be able to point at me as a disgruntled former employee running an inside campaign against him. Whatever I built, it needed to be airtight, and it needed to come from sources nobody could accuse me of manipulating. What I did instead was read. Tennessee health inspection records are public. Sales tax filings give you a rough volume picture if you know how to interpret them. A small item in the Nashville Business Journal noted a supplier dispute involving a local distribution company and a Franklin restaurant group. I found a lien recorded against the Brentwood property, the second location, the one my father had paid off in full by 2003, in the County Register of Deeds, which is also public. I found a second lien on the same property 8 months later. I reached out to a woman named Dara Wickfield. We'd gone to Belmont together, and she'd spent the decade since doing forensic accounting work for a law firm in Brentwood. She wasn't a close friend exactly, more the kind of person you can call when you need someone precise and discreet and honest enough to tell you when you're wrong. I bought her dinner at a Thai place near her office, spread out everything I had, and asked if she'd be willing to do a legal, above-board review using only publicly available filings and the operational knowledge I could share from my own time at the company. No inside documents, no confidential anything. She said she'd take it on as a side project and see what was actually there. What she found over the following 4 months was not subtle once you knew what to look for. Mitch Farrow had restructured 3 of our primary vendor contracts through a procurement consulting firm that, according to Tennessee Secretary of State corporate filings, listed Mitch's older brother as a managing principal. The fees that consulting firm billed to Rand Smokehouse were running at roughly double the market rate for comparable procurement services. The 4th location, the Gallatin expansion my father had planned to fund through operating cash flow over 2 years, methodically, the way he'd done everything, had instead been financed by a business line of credit drawn against the collateral of the Franklin property. My father's original restaurant, the one he'd rebuilt with his own hands in 1989, the one that had his name on it in letters he'd painted himself, because he couldn't afford a sign shop that first year. Total exposure between the 2 liens and the outstanding credit line came to just under $2.1 million. against a business that, by Dara's estimate from the public sales tax records, was running revenue trends consistent with a meaningful decline from its peak. She noted specifically that the expense restructuring through the procurement firm would be difficult to characterize as fraud. Mitch had been careful, but that it would be equally difficult to characterize as anything other than a serious conflict of interest once a neutral party laid it all out sequentially. I sat with that report for 6 weeks before I did anything. I want to be specific about those 6 weeks because I've had people ask me why I waited, implying I was being passive or strategic in some theatrical way. I wasn't performing patience. I was genuinely waiting for the moment when doing nothing would no longer be a viable option for anyone, when the situation would demand a response, rather than merely invite one that could be dismissed. I knew the business line of credit was up for review at the end of the quarter. I knew the bank would require updated financials and a fresh collateral assessment. I knew Burke's numbers wouldn't survive that review, and I knew that the moment he realized it, there would be pressure to find someone to absorb the blame. I was not going to be in that position. I was going to be in the position of the person who arrived with the solution already documented. Lacey called me on a Wednesday evening in early March. She wasn't calling about soccer or the neighbor dispute. She was calling because she'd overheard Burke and Mitch talking in the back office about exploring options for the Franklin location, and she didn't know what that meant exactly, but she knew it wasn't good, and she'd had 3 different coworkers pull her aside in the past 2 weeks, asking if she thought the company was going to make it through summer. She told me she had a kid and a mortgage, and she'd stayed through everything, because she believed in what the name meant. And then she asked me, quietly, if I thought she should start looking. That call ended my waiting. I didn't call Burke. I didn't draft an email laying out his failures point by point, which I had been tempted to do more than once in the previous 3 years. Instead, I called a man named Stan Bowen, who had been my father's first outside investor and had held a seat on the Rand Smokehouse board since 1994. Stan was 71, semi-retired, and spent most of his time at his farm outside of Dixon. He was the only person on that board who had known my father since before the business existed. He'd sat with me under the prep tables in the Franklin kitchen when I was 9 years old, teaching me gin rummy during slow Tuesday lunches, letting me count cards just to see if I was paying attention. I drove to his farm on a Saturday morning. I put Dara's report on his kitchen table. He read every page without speaking. When he finished, he went back and reread 2 sections. Then he set it down and looked at me for a moment and said, "Your father would have seen this coming," which was probably true. Then he picked up his phone and made 2 calls. By Monday, there was an emergency board meeting scheduled for the following Thursday. I wasn't asked to attend. I didn't need to be. Stan presented the findings. By the end of that meeting, the board had voted to engage an independent auditor and requested that Mitch step back from his CFO responsibilities during the review period. Burke retained his title technically, but the operational authority he'd been exercising was effectively suspended pending the audit's completion. He came to my apartment 4 days later. I hadn't seen him in almost 2 years, and he looked like someone who hadn't slept, his shirt wrinkled in a way that suggested he'd slept in it rather than in a bed. He stood in my doorway without being invited in and told me I had always been jealous of him, that I had never forgiven him for being the one our father trusted at the end, that this whole thing was personal for me, not about the business at all. I let him finish. "You hired your friend to handle our vendor contracts," I said, "and he ran the fees through a company where his brother was a managing partner and charged us double what those services were worth. You borrowed against Dad's original building to finance an expansion that's bleeding money. You let 2 pitmasters walk out the door, men who trained for years to do what they did, rather than give them raises they'd been waiting on for 3 years. And you're telling me this is about jealousy." He switched tactics then, the way I had been expecting him to. He reminded me of things from when we were kids, helping our father build the original smoker in the backyard over one long weekend, family road trips, the way our father used to let us help with the sauce batches on Saturday mornings, like it was something sacred. He said family takes care of family. He said I was burning everything down over a financial disagreement that could have been handled privately, between us, if I hadn't gone running to Stan. "I tried to handle things privately," I said. I sat in that conference room while you told me I led with emotion, and I left quietly, and I spent 3 years learning to put everything I knew into language you said you respected. And you're standing here telling me I should have come to you privately first? He had no answer for that. The anger drained out of him, and what was left looked like exhaustion and something I couldn't quite name. Not guilt exactly. More like the recognition of a story that hadn't gone the way he'd written it in his head. He left without saying anything else. The audit confirmed everything Dara had documented, and identified 2 additional arrangements that her public record review hadn't been able to surface. The procurement consulting fees were terminated immediately. Mitch resigned before the audit's findings were formally released. The lien situation on the Franklin property was restructured through a refinancing agreement the bank accepted once the board presented them with a credible operational recovery plan, which I helped write at Stan's informal request before I was officially back in any capacity. The 2 outside board members Burke had installed voted to step down rather than face continued scrutiny. Burke kept his shares, which he was legally entitled to, and stepped away from all operational involvement. He didn't make a formal announcement. He just stopped showing up, and the organization moved on without looking back, the way organizations do when the alternative is to stand still. Lacey was promoted to Regional Operations Manager for Middle Tennessee. She called me from the Murfreesboro parking lot to tell me, barely holding it together, and I wasn't holding it together either, which surprised me. I'd been keeping a kind of professional distance from my own feelings about all of it for so long that the relief hit harder than I expected. 3 months after the audit closed, the board offered me the CEO position. Not Director of Operations, not an advisory role, CEO. I said I'd accept it on 2 conditions. First, that the board formally document a governance structure for succession that reflected what my father had actually intended. Not a legal pad without binding weight that could be quietly amended in a bylaw vote I wasn't invited to attend, but a proper framework with a real shareholder vote behind it. Second, that the Gallatin expansion get a full operational and financial review before another dollar went into it. The board agreed to both within a week. Stan made sure the governance document was signed before he retired from the board for good. I walked into the Franklin location on a Tuesday morning in late October, 4 months after I'd formally come back. I stood in the kitchen for a while before the lunch service started. The smoker was running. You could smell the brisket from the parking lot, which meant whoever had been tending it since before dawn had gotten the wood ratio right. My father used to say you could read the whole management culture of a smokehouse just from standing outside in the early morning. If the smell reached you before you got to the door, somebody was paying attention. The pit lead that day was someone I had hired. 26 years old, trained under one of the pitmasters my brother had let walk. I'd tracked that man down. He was working at a place in Smyrna, doing well but not doing this, and paid him as a consultant for 3 months to come train the new crew. It cost money the business wasn't flush with. But the alternative was serving brisket that tasted like someone's approximation of Rand smokehouse brisket. And that is the one thing no balance sheet figure can fix after the fact. My father used to say the product is the whole argument. If the product is right, you have something worth fighting for. If it isn't, you're managing the slow decline of a name, and no amount of brand strategy changes that math. I think about my brother sometimes, not with the bitterness I carried in the early years. Something more complicated. A kind of sad recognition that he is genuinely capable, that he has real skills, and that those skills had almost nothing to do with what this specific business needed. The gap between what he knew and what he didn't know was the exact width of everything my father had spent 30 years building. Burke understood expansion and leverage and market positioning. He did not understand that Rand Smokehouse was not a concept to be scaled. It was a practice. Something closer to craft than product. You cannot leverage a pitmaster's relationship with wood and time and temperature. You can only protect it or lose it. I saw him at my aunt's house the Thanksgiving after everything had settled. He was quieter than I'd ever seen him in my life. We didn't speak directly. At some point during the evening, across a room full of people and noise, and the particular warmth of a family gathering that pretends nothing has happened, he looked at me and held the look for a moment before turning away. There was something in his face I didn't have a clean word for. Not an apology exactly. Not remorse. Something more like acknowledgement. The recognition that the story had gone the way it went, and he understood why. It wasn't enough to undo 3.5 years, but it was something I hadn't expected, and I've thought about it more than I'd like to admit. My father named Burke CEO because he was scared and running out of time, and Burke came in with a slide deck when my father needed to believe someone had a plan. I've made my peace with that. My father was doing the best he could with what he had left. He wasn't wrong about Burke's capabilities in general. He was wrong about what this particular business required, and he didn't have the time to find out. What I know, what I have had to build myself into knowing, is that I didn't need my father's designation to prove what was true. I needed the years away. I needed the hard education in rooms where nobody knew my name or cared about my family history. I needed to learn to speak in the language my brother had used to dismiss me, fluently enough that there was nothing left to dismiss. My brother told me I led with emotion rather than data. He wasn't entirely wrong. At 28 in that conference room, I was angry and grieving and attached in ways I hadn't learned to manage. Some of what I said came from love and loss rather than evidence, and he used that against me because it was the easiest thing available to use. I spent 3.5 years turning that emotion into something nobody could argue with, turning it into line item analyses and audit trails, and a 47-page operational recovery plan that convinced a regional bank to restructure a $2.1 million collateral position. Not because I stopped feeling everything I felt. Because I learned that feeling without proof is easy to ignore, and I had spent enough of my life being easy to ignore. That's done now. The Franklin Smokehouse has been open for 35 years. My father's original pit smoker sits in a case near the entrance, a little rusted and a lot beloved. Every person I hire gets a 5-minute story about where it came from. The scrapyard in Leiper's Fork, the $14,000 loan, the first Friday night when the line went out the door, and my father stood in the parking lot, not knowing whether to laugh or cry. I tell it because I want people to understand what they're walking into. Not a brand, not a scalable concept, not IP waiting to be leveraged. Something someone built with his hands, because he believed it was worth building. I believe that too. I've always believed it. I just had to spend 3.5 years earning the right to say so, in a room where people had to listen.